Marshal Ney was born in 1769 in modern-day Germany, near the Rhine, close to frontier fortresses. His father was a well-off landowner, but still considered a peasant. He served in the 7 Years' War and would tell Ney stories that fascinated him and inspired him. Ney wanted to be a soldier, but his father refused due to their peasant lineage. He would never rise more than the rank of corporal. His father was able to use his wealth and influence to get Ney a chance of being a lawyer, due to it being a lucrative career for a peasant. At the young age of 13, Ney set off to work, spending endless hours in a stuffy office surrounded by papers, reading tiny font. Endlessly bored, like any child, he escaped, becoming an ironworker and then working in mines for a couple years. Finally, he quit to join the Hussars regiment and chased after his dream of becoming a soldier. In the Hussars, Ney would get in constant trouble, dueling and fighting. Ney even went as far as to challenge the company's fencing master and broke his wrist during a duel. During this fight, the commander of the regiment grabbed Ney's hair and threw him to the ground, and then sent him to jail. The men in his regiment signed a petition and got him released. Later in life, when Ney was Marshal of France, he found the fencing master in poverty, not able to work due to his wrist being permanently damaged by the duel years ago. Disgusted, Ney gave him a pension and got him out of poverty. Later on, Ney was transferred to logistics and used his previous experience as a lawyer to great success in managing the heavy amounts of record-keeping and organization involved in logistics work. During the Revolution, the Hussars were absorbed into General Kelber's army, and Ney would be assigned to escort Kelber. Kelber saw that Ney was decisive and had a strong tactical sense, so he promoted Ney to adjacent general and put him in charge of guarding supply posts and logistic depots. Ney would spend long hours in the saddle chasing off bandits. Ney would later receive a second promotion after he attacked and scattered a screen of cavalry that was raiding his supply lines. The new command was frontline action, and Ney was tasked with raiding the Austrian right flank and attacking their supply trains near an Austrian fortress along the Meuse River. During this time, they would come across a lot of deserters from the French Republic, fleeing for their lives, and instead of sending them back to France, where they would surely be killed, he would feed them and then set them free, pretending they escaped into the night. General Cabert figured this out and did not care, later saying, "He knows how to take care of his fellow Frenchmen." During the raid, Ney was able to capture a supply train and send it back to the general. A deserter in their regiment later alerted the Austrians of the raid and surrounded Ney. Ney attacked at the weakest point, breaking out the encirclement and capturing the Austrian commander in the process. After this feat, he was made colonel. It was a spectacular career move for Ney. In the days of the Bourbons, it would take a whole lifetime just to reach the rank of corporal. Calbert was ordered to move north and help in an offensive. It was reassigned and placed under Bernadotte, who was raiding behind enemy lines and taking supply trains with flying columns. Ney helped and harassed elements of infantry. On October 1st, Calbert linked up with General Jourdan's forces and fought at the Battle of Rohr in an attempt to push the invaders across the Rhine. Ney was able to gather accurate intelligence of the Austrian strength that proved vital in the battle. The Austrian army broke and withdrew across the line. The Austrians regrouped with their other forces and then counterattacked on a broad front. Ney found orders from the Austrians that he found in an abandoned hotel that they stayed at for a night. Ney was able to use this information to capture another supply train, bringing him even higher up the military ladder. Ney would participate in siege warfare along the Rhine till he got wounded in a cavalry charge. Ney then returned home, welcome as a hero in his town, and returned back to the front for the 1795 campaign. They participated in more siege warfare along the Rhine. During this time, Archduke Charles took control over the Austrian forces and concentrated them, while the Republican forces were stretched out, opening them to be defeated in detail. The Republican forces were caught off guard and forced to retreat. Ney led the rear guard and rescued, later to be known as Marshal Soult's Corps, from total annihilation. Ney was offered position of general of brigade, but he refused, thinking he was too inexperienced. The Rhine front collapsed, causing a general retreat deeper into France. And then an armistice was negotiated because the Austrians eventually became overextended as much as the French Republic did. Ney got himself captured right before a final settlement was agreed. After the armistice, Ney was let go, and then the Directory sent him up north to prepare for an invasion of England. Ney was given some much-needed time off, but then was later sent back to the Rhine. due to the Directory believing the invasion of Egypt was far more important and practical than the invasion of England. War started up again with the Austrians and Russians. Ney was put under Bernadotte and given the command of cavalry, where he requested to raid across the Rhine and take some bridgeheads. He got permission from Bernadotte. The raid succeeded, and Ney was finally promoted to full general brigade. The Austrians pushed the Army of Rhine back once more, and Ney's gains were for nothing. Ney was then transferred to the Army of Switzerland and to defend strategic valleys with poorly equipped Swiss Republic infantry brigades, and then some French infantry with a handful of cavalry, with no artillery. Ney was then transferred north to take command of the forces at Teteaux, where he was supposed to take the center in a joint attack to take a couple Austrian outposts. During the attack, Ney found himself isolated and outnumbered, facing 15,000 Austrians. Ney held out as long as possible for reinforcements, but was forced to fall back. He led the daring rearguard and got shot twice during the retreat. His first action as general of division ended in failure. Ney performed well and failed due to actions beyond his control. He took some time off to recover from his wounds, and during this time, his brother was killed fighting Suroff in Italy. Messina won the First Battle of Zurich and was able to stabilize the front against Archduke Charles in Switzerland. Ney was home and depressed about his brother and not taking part in this grand victory of Zurich. The Army of the Rhine collapsed once again, and Ney was transferred, but this time promoted, to be in command of the Rhine front till someone with more experience could be found. Ney was an obvious choice, due to him not getting involved in politics and not having any royal blood. During this time, Ney rapidly reformed the shattered army the best he could, and was even able to push the Austrians out of the Rhine once more, due to the Austrian and Russian armies being overextended. During Ney's brief command, he was really able to reform and transform the high command of the Rhine front. In the year 1800s, the Austrians had been pushed across the left bank of the Rhine, but had taken all of Italy but Genoa. France was now open to a two-pronged invasion, and Napoleon overthrew the Republic and installed himself as first consul, returning from Egypt. During the campaigns of 1801 and 1804, Ney was a part of the first major joint Rhine offensive, with Napoleon, who was operating in Italy, taking personal command. Ney played a major role in the Battle of Holstein, the battle after Marengo, and captured a number of prisoners. The victory knocked the Austrians out of the war decisively. Napoleon noticed Ney's skill as a general and called Ney to Paris for them to meet. They had a brief meeting, and Ney refused to play the political game and went back home. Napoleon liked Ney because he was apolitical, so he decided to get him married and brought into the extended royal family. Josephine played a vital role in getting him married and helped him navigate the courting process. They wanted to sign up for the Haiti expedition, but got cold feet, which saved his life and career. Ney got married and took his new wife home, but had to leave early to take command of troops in Switzerland. Switzerland was in a state of rebellion, and Ney had to quickly take control and defeat the rebels. Ney did this decisively, not waiting for Napoleon's written orders to cross the Swiss border to restore order. Ney was able to put down a mutiny in his own ranks in Zurich and decisively capture the leaders in a couple hours. Ney later then became commander-in-chief of the French forces in Switzerland, and also the military governor, where he was an effective ruler in reorganizing their army and rebuilding infrastructure. During this time, he had his first son, named Joseph Napoleon. Ney joined Napoleon north to prepare for the Channel invasion. There, he helped train troops that would later become the Grand Armée. Napoleon made Ney Marshal of the Empire when he became emperor, admiring his military talent, especially in Switzerland and his brief command on the Rhine. During the Austerlitz campaign, Ney was put in charge of the 6th Corps of around 25,000 men. Ney had on his staff the military theorist Marshal Ney, who gave him important tactical advice during the campaign, and deserves a video in his own right. Ney moved quickly against the Austrians, with his men heavily attritioning due to rain and poor supplies. Marat moved as a screen probing forward. Ney attempted to cross the river and ran into trouble. The poor weather and supply issues tired his men, and they ran into issues with Marat, who was senior in rank but younger in age than Ney, and only held the rank only through marriage. They argued about how to attack the Austrians and cross the river. Ney made sound tactical judgments, but Marat ignored him. Ney was able to cross the river and defeat the Austrians by sheer force of will, breaking their lines and causing the Austrian holdouts to surrender. They would take no part in the famous Battle of Austerlitz, and instead had his force garrisoned several areas in Austria. In 1806, relations with Prussia and France broke down with war declared. Ney's corps launched into Prussia from Nuremberg. The Duke of Brunswick was Prussia's best general facing Napoleon. He saw an opportunity to attack the isolated French columns in the dual battles of Jean and Oberstadt. Napoleon was able to bring in reinforcements and defeat the Prussians. Ney followed Soult's corps into Prussia and struggled again with finding supplies. Soult had taken most of the supplies for his army during the march, leaving Ney's men starving. Genoa, Ney fought on Marshal Ney's left, bringing up 3,000 men and pushing further than Lannes, leaving him isolated, forced to fight off full counterattacks. Ney's cavalry took the Prussian guns under heavy fire, and his infantry fought off heavy Prussian cavalry sorties. Ney led from the front, rallying his men till Lannes and Soult came on his left and right. Once his lines were restored, the three marshals pressed the attack. The Prussians broke, with Murat charging in. Ney was ordered, during Prussian pursuit, put his men under Murat again, which infuriated him. Murat captured 14,000 men. When Berlin was taken, Napoleon ordered his Sixth Corps to march triumphantly into Berlin with him. The Sixth Corps was given a few days off, and then Ney and his men went with Napoleon to fight the Russians, who were now mobilized. Ney was sent to Thorn to take a small Prussian fort and one of the last Prussian holdouts. Once they saw Ney, the men fled. Ney needed to build bridges to get across, which slowed him down. Ney chased the Prussians till the weather made traversing impossible. On Christmas, Ney fought an indecisive battle with the Prussians, where 20,000 men were lost. Ney left Soult's flank exposed to take the city of Königsberg, the old Prussian capital, where Ney thought he could earn quick glory. Napoleon was livid that he broke rank. Ney disobeyed Napoleon's orders constantly, but was only punished if he failed to achieve results. He would continually make these mistakes, believing that he was in the right, making tactical mistakes and not seeing the big picture. At the Battle of Leu, Ney was told to march north and take the left flank. They did not take part in the battle and arrived late in the day. The battle was indecisive, with Napoleon's army being saved, with Murat leading another successful cavalry charge. After the indecisive battle, Napoleon ordered a retreat across the Vistula River to consolidate his lines and finish the siege of Danzig. Ney led the rear guard. Ney then quartered out in a college in Poland for the winter, and in May, Napoleon was able to muster 210,000 men against the Russians' 80,000. Napoleon regrouped and searched for the Russians to engage them in a set battle. Ney was ambushed by a massive Russian force while taking the advance guard. Ney was vastly outnumbered and fought another successful rearguard action, getting his men to safety. The rearguard was drawing in a large Russian force. This bought Napoleon vital time. Ney wrote to Napoleon after the battle, "I shall make the enemy lose another day tomorrow." Ney drew in more and more Russians to fight him during the second day, and this gave Napoleon time to bring up his full force. The battle would be later known as the Victory of Elchingen. Napoleon would later crown Ney the Prince of Elchingen. At the Battle of Friedland, Ney took the right flank, committing his infantry and cavalry, and smashing the Russians. He personally stormed the heights, and after the battle, Napoleon named him a lion. After the war, Ney took some much-needed time off and went home, where he rested for about a year. Napoleon decided to invade Spain and Portugal in a fast invasion. The situation collapsed into the infamous Peninsular War. Ney was called up to take command of the Sixth Corps again while they marched through Spain. Napoleon got frustrated with the slow progress his army was making in Spain. He blamed this on how his army was made of mostly new conscripts. Napoleon would later say, "I have sent the Spaniards lambs, who they have devoured. I shall send them wolves, who will devour them in return." Napoleon left his best units in Germany and Poland in fears of Russia and Austrian expansion. They rejoined the Sixth Corps and marched through France with them and then to Spain, where Napoleon met him. Napoleon's plan was to march to Madrid and defeat the Spanish army of 80,000 before the British force came to Madrid and linked up with the Spaniards. Ney was ordered to march to Aranda from Burgos on the main road to Madrid before attacking the generals Castano and Pillfox. He then directed Ney to move to his left to watch the passes through which the Spanish were likely to retire. Lannes and Unio drove them south. Napoleon hoped to catch the enemy between a hammer and an anvil. Ney had only 15,000 men, but found it difficult. The country was rough, For the first time, Ney was marching through openly hostile population. Supplies were practically non-existent. Ney ordered a general halt at Sarania and was afraid to move his army through the hill country. He was almost totally isolated with no communication. If he kept marching blindly, he could have hit a massive Spanish army by surprise. Napoleon blamed him for not hitting the Spanish, but forgave Ney, because after that incident, Ney smashed another Spanish army. Jean More's army of 20,000 men started retreating once Napoleon took Madrid. Soult and Ney were hot on his heels, and Napoleon left to fight the Austrians. Ney was sent to go to fight Spanish guerrillas. Ney effectively took Galicia and reorganized the province. He provided garrisons for the towns and patrolled the main roads, fighting off bandits. Communication were rare between Madrid and Paris, and Ney was effectively his own military governor. Ney was a good leader, but was hated by the people. He restored order to Galicia and forced tax collection. Ney went as far as to pay for the wives of Spaniards fighting for him in Spain. He gave them half pay by rank. He also was able to gain control of Galicia and turn his attention to helping other marshals fighting in Spain. Like I stated before, communication was rare due to the roads being harassed by bandits and guerrillas constantly, and orders were far and few in between. But sometimes orders would flood in. The marshals in Spain had no respect for Napoleon's brother, Jerome, who was now the king of Spain. One instance, an order came from Madrid about invading Portugal. Ney said, "It's drawn up by someone who knows nothing of our business. You may tell the king I have not come here to play his pawn." That's just typical Ney right there. In early April, Ney went on the attack, moving south. Ney ordered his men to pack light and brought only 5 guns. The marches were rough, with them passing through the mountains. The roads were tight and filled with bottlenecks. General Romana, who was facing Ney, could have done some damage to Ney's army but was reluctant. Once again, food was scarce and information was non-existent, with people fleeing at the sight of the French. Ney got in within 5 miles of Romana with having no idea where he was. By mid-May, Romana had evacuated, embarking on English transports. They went back to Galicia on the 12th of May. The British, under Wellington, had forced the passage at Doria. Wellington's preparations for the march into central Spain ended at Reveilla, so Galicia was safe for now. They worked closely with Soult, refitting Soult's army after he barely escaped from annihilation. The month prior, Soult was forced to retreat out of the northern frontier of Portugal with 6,000 men. He lost about 20,000. Together, they decided to march northward through Lyon. Ney and Soult also tried to take part of Vigio, where there were some Spanish holdouts, but they failed to take it. Holding Galicia became almost impossible, with the French now in full retreat out of Portugal, and the British Navy blocking all the ports. Portuguese and Spanish troops were now preparing for a massive offensive. Ney had to leave Galicia, but worked out a deal with the British to take care of all the wounded Frenchmen in the hospitals, and not leaving them in the hands of the Spanish people, who Ney did not trust. Ney then marched his way to Lyon and fought guerrillas the whole time. Ney moved his army to Salamanca for a few months and got his men refitted, and he even got reinforcements. Finally, Ney left for some time off and gave his command to Jean Ney, leaving him in charge. Ney was home only for a few days and was ordered to return to Salamanca to Jean Ney, making a few mistakes against the insurgents on the Portuguese border. Napoleon ordered him back, making Ney beyond livid. Ney then came back to Salamanca and got in a huge fight with Jean Ney and blamed him for the whole mess. Jean Ney resigned right there on the spot. In 1810, Napoleon planned to take Lisbon and sent orders for a summer offensive. Wellington held the Torres Vedras. The first step in the plan to take Lisbon, the marshals decided that they needed to take and siege a bunch of Portuguese frontier fortresses. Ney was hoping for the supreme command of the invasion of Portugal, but this was given instead to Messina. Ney would serve under him with Jean, who commanded the 8th Corps. In early June, the siege started. They immediately started fighting with Messina. Ney was proud and got petty over not getting the command. They would later become openly insubordinate, saying, "I am the Duke and Marshal of the Empire like you. As for you, the Prince of Essling, it is of no importance outside the duties that you tell me as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Portugal. I know it only too well So when you tell Marshal Ney to lead his troops against the enemy, you will see how he will obey you. Ney then carried on, saying that he would only listen to Berthier's orders, the Minister of War. You must understand that I do not fear your threats, Ney would later go on to write. Messina was beyond livid about this open insubordination, and he said, "It is impossible to do anything with that man." And then he would go on to tell Ney that he had to bend the knee to his will or he was out. Ney agreed to keep his job and obeyed. Ney was there when they had to breach one of the forts, and the governor there surrendered. The Sixth Corps took part in the siege of Beda, but took little part in this operation. And then Ney was a part of the advance to Lisbon. On the 25th, Wellington had his army of 40,000 make a stand. Messina prepared for the fight, and during the planning phase, Ney fought Messina on the plan of attack. Ney would claim that Messina's plan would leave his units unexposed and open for flanking. Messina didn't care. Ney took the right flank and was thrown back, and the battle would be a French defeat. Wellington would then retreat, leaving the French deep in hostile lines. Wellington would wait patiently as the French army dwindled, with their men slowly attritioning and living off the land. After a couple months, Wellington attacked, with the French army only having 30,000 men to bear. Wellington would then push the French into a full retreat. Ney fought this daring rearguard once again, and during this retreat, he started burning all the wagons, so they would have to move faster on foot. Ney started this fire by burning his own wagon, and then, without telling Messina, burned Messina's wagon, because Ney's petty. Messina, after this retreat, sacked Ney, who then later was even more openly insubordinate by refusing to make a stand in the northern borders of Portugal. Ney was then shelved till Napoleon called him up for service for the 1812 invasion of Russia. Napoleon gave Ney command of the Third Corps. He had about 35,000 men and 2,400 cavalry with him on the expedition. Only a third of his men spoke French. Most of his men were conscripts from the various kingdoms across the empire. They again struggled to find supplies. About 1,000 vital horses were killed during the first half of the campaign. Water was scarce and desertion was rampant. Ney did not fight an engagement yet, and his forces were dwindled to 2/3 of their original strength. Marat acted as a screen for Ney, fighting the forever retreating Russian army. Ney marched eastward to Smolensk. Marat and Ney both fought Bagration's rearguard actions, and they finally reached Smolensk on the 17th of May. Ney opened fire with his artillery and tried to take the city by himself, but was thrown back, getting wounded in the process. Napoleon brought his full force to Smolensk and ordered the city be taken. Ney took the center and once again tried to take the Russian city, and failed again. The Battle of Smolensk was a token stand before Moscow, and the Russians left in the night after the battle. Ney lost about 5,000 men trying to take the city, dwindling his forces even more. Ney traced the Russians. You like that? Like a little text right there, right in the middle of it, right? Be gone, cell phone, throw it across the room. Oh man, yeah, but Smolensk was it was just a heavy battle that was kind of useless at a certain extent, and didn't really achieve anything but attrition to French forces. So Ney, him and Marat, they keep pursuing the Russians. Now they're more on the plateau area, and the Russians start defending the vital roads to Moscow. Ney tries to, take these vital roads, and he fights in close hand-to-hand combat in tandem with Davout's Corps. Ney, during these fighting for these vital roads, loses another 3,000 men. During this time, Barclay resigned his command to General Kutuzov, who made a stand at Borodino. Kutuzov had with him about 21,000 men and 640 guns, along with 15,000, newly raised militia. Ney took the center and fought for almost the entire 15 hours of the battle. He attacked on the plains, he stormed the redoubts leading from the front, and he also, during this time, was trying to convince Napoleon to commit to Olgar, particularly near the end of the battle, to finish it. Napoleon, of course, refused because he was afraid that the Frenchmen they did have with him on the expedition, if they were all to die, he would be left with just tributary states and Germans with him, and he was afraid that something might happen to him. They marched his Third Corps proudly into Moscow, but the city was deserted. His men were stationed in the suburbs of Vladimir. Once the city caught on fire, he got orders from Napoleon not to loot the city. Ney ignored this order, knowing that the few men he had left would not follow his orders. So he organized them into Luton battalions and committed them into the city. They spent a short time in the Vladimir suburbs, finding food and sending more men out to look for more food. Before leaving the city, he sent his 10,000 men out of once 35,000 to be reviewed in front of the Kremlin. The review was short, and his men were weak with hunger, and their boots were worn down. They retreated down the southward side of Moscow, building as many wagons as possible. His men carried as much loot as they could, till starvation forced them to stop, leaving a trail of gold in the cold snow. Ney's men suffered from starvation, and they ate their own horses. They fought off endless bands of Cossacks that stormed their flanks. Ney was forced to abandon his cannons to the merciless Russian snow. They marched their way to Smolensk. Napoleon wanted to refit his men there. Once they reached the Villesma, Ney swapped places with Davout's First Corps and took the rear guard once again. Due to Davout losing most of his men, the 1st and 4th Corps became almost unrecognizable mobs, with men throwing their muskets into the snow. Ney was given orders to make a stand at Torgoza, but it collapsed in a few hours, with the Russians storming the town. The men made a poor stand for Ney, and the marshal freaked out, blaming his officers for not rallying them. The Third Corps crossed the Dnieper and fought hard winds that brought their progress to a slow crawl. While crossing, they had to leave the rest of their guns behind. On November 14th, they made it to Smolensk with 3,000 men, of the once 10,000 he had left with. Ney received 2 more divisions and got his men refitted with guns and ammo. On the 15th, they took up the position in the suburbs of Smolensk and fought off another band of Russians. On the 17th, they left Smolensk with about 7,000 men, who were constantly harassed by Cossacks. Davout and Ney were starting to lose pace with each other. Davout had to temporarily abandon Ney to his fate. The Cossacks fully surrounded the column, and a cavalry officer rode forward asking Ney to surrender. Ney replied, "A marshal of France cannot surrender." Lord Atteridge describes this scene. The Russian, in his brilliant cavalry uniform, with a fur fleece wrapped around him, mounted a sleek charger, presented a striking contrast to the marshal and his officers. A group of haggard-looking men in ragged uniforms huddled together amid the fog and snow, with the weary battalions halted close by and crowds of disorganized men waiting anxiously to know their fate. Ney asked for a truce to ponder his situation. Later in the day, the fighting started up again, and Ney took the envoy as prisoner. For endless hours, the men lay huddled together, fighting for their lives as wave after wave of cavalry and infantry charged forward. Ney was able to rally his men and make a stand. During a lull in the fighting, an officer recorded this conversation. "What do we do now?" an officer asked. "Get to the other side of the Dnieper," Ney said confidently. "Where is the way to it? We shall find out." "But what if it's not frozen over?" the officer asked. "It will be," Ney reassured. Ney waited till dark to lead his men to the river. Ney had a terrible map that gave him little instruction, but he was able to make it to a tributary that led him to the Dnieper. They had guides that led him to the part where the ice was thickest. The ice was very thin, and he was only able to send men single file across the ice on a few vital points. Once his men were across, he tried to bring his horses. Some made it, while others fell into the ice. The wounded fell into the ice, and Ney lunged forward, hands on knees, pulling the men out of the water the best he could. Ney was able to cross the river and abandon his wagons. His men had to march on foot for days in search of food and shelter. The Cossacks met them on the other side of the river, but kept their distance at first. Later, they brought sled artillery and attacked, and they once again defended his column with fury, this time with musket in hand, fighting them off. Ney barely made it out alive, but was able to link up with Davout and Eugene. Ney was livid and got in an argument with Davout. Told him, "As for me, Monsieur le Marshal, I do not reproach you. God sees us, and he will judge us." I love this. Ney's fantastic. Ney blamed Davout for his encirclement, while Davout argued that Ney was being too slow. Napoleon took Ney's side and said that Ney was the bravest of the brave. Ney was then put into reserve till another river crossing. These crossings were slow due to the fact that Napoleon wanted to take as many cannons with him as possible, and wagons. On the 28th, the Russians attacked on both sides of the Brazina River. Napoleon committed the last of his Imperial Guard to hold the bridge head on the western bank. Onio was on the other side of the river, and he was wounded. Napoleon then put Ney in charge of the Second Corps. Ney took the Russians off guard by ordering a desperate countercharge, taking about 2,000 prisoners and 5 guns. Napoleon later claimed that Ney saved his army. Once again, Ney took the rear guard till they made it back to Poland, relative safety. Napoleon then left to raise a new army in Paris for the soul of the empire. Before the 1813 campaign, Ney was able to go home and get some much-needed rest. During this time, Napoleon called up 500,000 men to save the empire. Napoleon took the young, disabled, and elderly into service, along with retired officers. Ney was ordered to go to East Prussia and take command of the Third Corps, which was now renewed to around 37,000 men, along with 1,300 weak cavalry. Most of Ney's force was made up of untrained levies who would fight with fury and determination in the campaign to come. Napoleon consolidated in southern Germany and prepared to make a dash to Leipzig to liberate the northern Polish garrisons where his troops were held out under siege. Ney took the vanguard, advancing down the Lutzen Road. On April 29th, his raw recruits saw action against Russian cavalry. Ney's men held firm, forming squares. On the next day, the same attack happened, and they held, proving that to the world that these new soldiers made up for the lack of experience with just anger and fury and determination. It's fascinating. After the Russian defeat, Napoleon and Marat had effectively killed every horse in Europe, giving the Allies total supremacy in movement and screening. Napoleon had little information on the Allies' movement and pushed to Leipzig, having Eugene move his 3 corps of Imperial Guard to take the city. Ney held the south in case of Allied movements. Ney was able to rely on reinforcements Mormont and Baton, who were close by. Once Ney got his men in position, he rode with Napoleon to the city, and they both witnessed the Old Guard take the city, pushing out the small token force that occupied it. After the city was taken, Ney and Napoleon both noticed that cannons were firing off near Lutzen, where Ney's corps was. Napoleon told Ney, "It looks as if, while we have attacked their flank here, they have been turning us. But no harm is done. They will find us everywhere, prepared to meet them." He then sent Ney to command his corps in what would later be known as the Battle of Lutzen. Ney rode back to find his men being thrown off their strategic high ground and being pushed on the low ground as well. They witnessed the overwhelming Russian cavalry superiority and Cossacks descending into the low ground, charging Ney's corps. Ney's men held as best they could, fighting off the Russians with bayonet, slowly retreating ridge by ridge. The Third Corps was holding 2 strategic villages. Ney rode to the one on the left, where his men were on their last leg, awaiting their fate, as Blucher launched his finishing blow. Ney inspired his men in his cool, collective demeanor under combat. Right as the Prussians reached the town, Ney ordered a signature, devastating countercharge that threw the Prussians backwards. Ney then led the charge, following through with his momentum, taking the high ground around the villages. MacDonald's corps arrived and reinforcements that decided the battle. Blucher was able to call in his massive reserve and force a counterattack, pushing Ney's exhausted corps back once again, losing the high ground. Blucher led the charge in person and got wounded trying to take the village. Ney witnessed as Napoleon rode to the field and helped him rally the center, screaming to his rawest recruits, "Young men, I count on you to save the empire, or will you desert me?" His men then rallied in fury and counterattacked in witness of the emperor. Once again, Ney was leading from the front, breaking the now committed Prussian Guard regiment. The Old Guard arrived and the battle was saved. Napoleon could not follow up his victory due to the fact that he had no cavalry, so the Allies were able to go in full retreat, and they even abandoned Dresden, giving it to Napoleon. After the battle, Napoleon gave Ney an independent command out of the respect for him given in the snows of Russia and the recent battles of 1813. Ney moved his force to Berlin, but was close enough to the Grand Armée to react if they were in danger. Napoleon planned to bring his allies into a decisive battle and end the war right there. he wanted Ney to cut the Allied retreat. Ney moved in the direction of Berlin and suddenly changed course, scaring the Allies. A combined Russian and Prussian force was sent to meet him. Napoleon pressed forward, leaving Dresden and driving the Allies backwards. Napoleon planned a decisive battle, but that wasn't going to happen because Ney did not cut the Allied retreat as ordered. The battle started off strong, with Napoleon making steady progress. Ney started his flank, taking the Russians off guard. The Russians had only 13,000 men against Ney's now 60,000. Ney made slow and steady progress, but waited for each corps to catch up to each other. He was afraid of leaving them exposed to being defeated in detail. This slowed down his flanking maneuver. If Ney stuck with his orders as they were intended, he would have cut the Allied retreat, splitting the armies in half. Ney was too slow, and once he did reach the fighting, he waited for each of his corps to link up with one another before he attacked. The Allies were able to skillfully withdraw and escaped with little casualties. Napoleon, of course, without having any cavalry, could not follow up on this technical victory. After this battle, the Austrians decided to join the war and overthrow Napoleon. This dramatically turned the scales, and this now put Napoleon on the defensive, and Ney was reassigned to a reactionary role, now in charge of his corps again. Napoleon kept him close and overlooked his failure to defeat the Allied armies at Butzen. I remember reading a comment in my Iron Marshal video where a guy wondered, what if Davout had been a part of the 1813 campaign instead of people were discussing a scenario where Davout was at Waterloo. And I never thought about Davout in the 1813 campaign, but really in this flanking maneuver, I really think this is basically what he would be good at, this really devastating flank attack. That's something to ponder. Napoleon gave Ney command of the Young Guard during the Battle of Dresden, where Napoleon, even though sick, was able to defeat a massive converging Allied force. Once again, the Allies were able to withdraw due to lack of cavalry. Lucky enough, Murat returned from Naples with a fighting force of cavalry and was able to take around 13,000 prisoners. Onio was defeated by Bernadotte, who changed sides, leading the Swedes. Ney took this to heart and demanded Napoleon to let him take a force to Berlin to fight the traitor. Ney took command of the Northern Army and fought at Wittenberg with orders to march against Bernadotte, who had around 100,000 men at his disposal. Ney was able to take Berlin, but was having issues with his commanders, who were almost in open revolt. Renier, commander of the 7th, fought Ney openly, and Onio, commander of the 12th, was enraged that he was demoted under Ney. Ney pressed forward regardless in search of Bernadotte, who was now outside Berlin with a joint Swedish, Russian, Prussian force that was kind of divided. Ney planned to do a signature Napoleonic maneuver and defeat these armies in detail before they can be linked up. What would later be known as the Battle of Dennowitz completely failed, and this was due to incorrect deployment of divisions that arrived set-piece to the battle. The terrain was unfamiliar for Ney, with massive dust columns distorting his visibility. During the height of the battle, Ney ordered Onio to move to his right, even though Onio, we later discovered, saw an opening to shatter the left flank. But despite Ney, he moved right. His commanders just periodically arrived, and Ney's force was only truly able to do a fighting chance when all the Swedish and Prussian and Russian forces were linked up, and now Ney was outnumbered, and the battle was over. This time, the retreat was slow, and Ney lost about 23,000 men and 83 guns. Ney was livid at this result, and he blamed Onio and Renier for this defeat. After the battle, Ney would write to Berthier stating the following: "The morale of the generals and officers as a whole is strangely shaken. To command under such a condition is only to be half a commander. I would rather be a soldier. I beg that His Majesty will be so good as to take me away from this hell. I think I need not speak of my devotion to him. I'm ready to shed the last drop of my blood, but I want it to be shed for some useful end. The actual state of things, the presence of the Emperor is the only thing that will put this force together. I cannot but go on repeating that it is absolutely impossible to make General Renier obey. He never executes the orders he receives. I request that either this general or I myself shall be sent elsewhere. He did not know that Onio disobeyed him in the battle, in that flanking maneuver, that he could have shattered the army. Napoleon did nothing at Ney's request. He was too busy to really, go into this affair and do an investigation. Ney's army was in bad shape. Low on food and sickness spread through the ranks. The long marches brought desertion, and they were just wandering. It almost was like a band of soldiers walking aimlessly through Germany searching for food. Napoleon ordered Ney to try to take Berlin, but Ney refused, saying that his men were in no way in combat condition. He was then ordered to retreat with the rest of the Grand Army to Leipzig, where he took command of his Third Corps once again. The Battle of Leipzig. Ney was put in reserve on the first day, and he spent it marching from one side of the city to another in a support and reserve role. On the 17th, rain hit the battlefield, and there was little fighting, but Ney was not a part of any of it. During the night of the 17th, Napoleon went to Ney's tent and gave him personal command of all forces north of the city of Leipzig. On the 18th, Ney led his men with determination, fighting through the northern part of the city. Ney got shot out from under him twice and then hit in the shoulder. His men were able to get the wounded marshal home to recover, and by the 1814 campaign, Ney was ready to defend France itself. Napoleon faced overwhelming odds, and his marshals had been reduced to basically corps commanders. The men hoped the Allies would retire for the winter, giving them time. But the massive armies poured into France to topple the emperor. 1814 campaign. Ney took command of the Young Guard that was now made up of 2,500 men in total. Ney fought in all of the major battles of the brief 1814 campaign with desperate tenacity, personally leading his now small corps into combat. After the loss of Paris, Ney rallied the other marshals to force Napoleon to abdicate his throne. He even got in a heated exchange with Napoleon screaming at him, "The army listens to me." And Ney coolly replied, "The army listens to its generals." Napoleon abdicated, and Ney was one of the few marshals that stood up to him, not wanting to get involved in the civil war with half the country now in Allied hands. Ney helped in the negotiations of Napoleon and the army's surrender, and brought the war to a close. After the war, Ney was allowed to keep his title of Marshal of France along with his princely titles that Napoleon gave him so many years ago. Ney hated the Restoration. He viewed the Ancien regime to be pompous, arrogant. Ney, who came from a working-class background, just hated them. Ney's wife would constantly be belittled and made fun of in court, and this further enraged Ney. He went as far as to write, "Those people know nothing. They don't understand what the name Ney means. I shall teach them." It's a nice threat right there. It got to the point that Ney left Paris and went off to the country in self-exile. Ney stayed away from the political movements inside the city and wanted to overthrow the old regime. In early March, he received a letter from Marshal Soult for him to return to Paris and command the 6th Division. He had no idea what he was fighting, but he knew a crisis was about to happen. Ney spoke to the king and found out that Napoleon had returned. Ney later stated that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. While Ney was marching against Napoleon, he was at first optimistic, stating that "I shall settle accounts with Bonaparte." The royalists that rode with Ney started hyping him up, stating that he was the savior of France by making Napoleon abdicate the first time, and that he would defeat Napoleon in battle and save France a second time. Ney spent a night at an inn where he read Napoleon's proclamation to the army and noticed that Napoleon's popularity had not waned. Ney started to fear that Napoleon would kill him for making him abdicate the first time. The next day, Ney found out that his men were more loyal to the emperor than to him. Ney later found out that the Bourbons had left the country and that he was one of the last holdouts of the Angevin regime. Ney left alone, and after receiving a letter from Napoleon, he decided to join them reluctantly, later saying, "I lost my head." Ney would later write an essay to Napoleon calling on him to appeal to the soul of the nation and that he should return. Napoleon read this letter in front of him and halfway through tore it up, whispering to one of his staffers that he was crazy. Ney let the loyalists in his ranks leave the nation, and the rest would rejoin Napoleon for the final campaign. Nauvoo, now Minister of War, gave Ney a couple of basic assignments to overlook frontier fortresses. After this assignment, Ney was shelved. Napoleon needed him for the upcoming war, but did not trust him. Ney would spend most of his time back home. Napoleon eventually gave him a position in the new Senate that formed, and in an almost afterthought, Napoleon decided to bring Ney with him on his last adventure. Ney went with no staff and just an old friend. They did not even have horses and spent half the journey on foot. Ney was able to find horses eventually and equipment along the way, and once he linked up with Napoleon surprisingly gave him command of the First Corps, around 45,000 men and 72 guns. Ney was honored and marched with the emperor. At Quatre Bras, Ney was tasked to attack Wellington on the Brussels road, while Napoleon pressed the Prussians. Wellington's army was on the move to reinforce the Prussians, and if Ney hit Wellington with his full force, he could have wiped out Wellington while he was on the march and distracted. But Ney lost the energy he had once possessed. He did not bring up his full force to bear against Wellington during the fighting. Something was wrong with him. He was lethargic and lacked initiative. He did not use the night or morning to reinforce his corps. He spent a long summer morning doing nothing. Napoleon would later say he is a different man. The whole army was different now, though. Communication between the rest of the army was a lot slower, and the organization of the army was not like it was in 1805 or 1812. During the fighting, Napoleon wanted Ney to redirect troops against the Prussians after he smashed through Wellington, turn around and flank and annihilate the Prussian army, knocking them out of the war. When Ney read the letter, he got mad and freaked out, refusing to follow the orders, screaming like a lunatic, according to staff officers. But when Ney was reading this letter, Wellington was actually able to return and bring his whole force to bear against Ney, and then push forward, forcing Ney to leave the field. This, of course, enraged Ney, not Ray. Napoleon would blame Ney for not assisting him and belittled him in a letter. Ney, furious and dying to redeem himself, decided that at Waterloo, this was where he was going to make his mark. Ney moved his army to join Napoleon, and at the Battle of Waterloo, he took the center and marched forward, but was repulsed by Picton during a counterattack, and his horse was shot out from under him, the one horse he had. Ney led the desperate cavalry charge into the British squares later in the afternoon. Finding another horse, he led 76 squadrons into the fray and got shot out from under him 2 more times. During the fighting, he would repeatedly charge British guns and then dismounting, flipping them over and doing what he can to get rid of them. And his shirt was covered in bullet holes, and he would actually ride up and attack British squares. He was an absolute madman. After the cavalry attack failed, Napoleon gave Ney command of the Old Guard, where he led from the front in a last desperate attack to beat the British before the Prussians arrived. With sword in hand, he rushed forward. During this charge, a sharpshooter a stray bullet shot Ney's sword, and it shattered, and all he had was the hilt. So Ney would repeatedly, after this Old Guard attack broke, would repeatedly try to rally men with just the hilt of his sword, screaming. And one time he got enough men together and he screamed, "See how a Marshal of France can die," and then he ran toward the British guns in fury. He somehow still survived this, and eventually he was in one of those Old Guard square holdouts, fighting off counterattacks with the last of his being, his soul. knowing that if he would survive this battle, he would die. So eventually he fought basically till he was by himself, covered in gunpowder and holes with the hilt of his sword, completely unrecognizable. Ney eventually made his way back to Paris alone, where a friendly officer gave him his horse. During his ride back to Paris, he tried to rally men together to make a stand, but only found wandering husks of men. They then went back to Paris to find Davout, and he wanted him and Davout to make a stand together to try to rally, to do something, anything. Once he reached Paris, Ney kind of saw the writing on the wall, and he got fake passports from a friend for him and his wife so they could escape the country. Ney actually planned to escape to America, particularly Louisiana, where he got where one of his friends actually gave him a list of people he could contact in the city for help and help him find work. But Ney hesitated, and that would cost him his life. News of Grouchy's men making it back to Paris brought him some hope that they could still win the war somehow. Ney left Paris right as the Allies marched into the city, and then he tried to go to the Swiss border, but the Austrians were blocking the roads. So Ney hid in a couple places, waiting for news of events. He found out that the Bourbons wanted Ney to be court-martialed. Eventually, he was able to make contact with his wife, who said that he should hide with some relatives. Ney stayed there for about a week, but was found out by royalists who recognized him. Ney was then taken prisoner and brought back to Paris for a trial to determine his fate. Funny enough, the king did not even want to put Ney on trial, and thought that he gave the marshal ample time to leave the country. He viewed Ney's arrest as an embarrassment. On Ney's way to Paris, he was harassed by Cossacks who threw food at him and tailed the convoy, yelling at him with remarks. It was awful. Once he made it to Paris, he was brought to prison, where he played the flute, a German tradition which he learned when he was general of the Rhine. The police tried to make him confess to crimes and reveal all the conspirators in the restoration of Napoleon, and they did neither, because, a marshal of France does not beg or, flip. Ney was put on trial, where he refused to go to a military court, believing that the higher-ups in the army would, sentence him to death. So instead he had a civilian trial. Ney and his defense fought hard to save him. Ney even actually had a couple freakouts in court when people would lie, and he would actually belittle them during like a cross-examination. It was crazy. This trial was a complete show trial, but Ney did his best. Ney's defense was that he intended to follow the orders, but he was isolated on the verge of and his men were on the verge of mutiny, and that he was in an impossible situation, which is true. He was stuck in the middle of he was surrounded. The Bourbons didn't leave a fight; they just ran out of the country and they left Ney isolated. In his defense, a bunch of corps commanders and Davout would come to Ney, to try to put something together, to try to make him innocent, because I think in a certain extent he was kind of swept up in events, and I think the death penalty was really just dramatic and really just an example. Ney applied to everybody he could. He even applied to Wellington, who refused, unfortunately. But near the end of the trial, Ney accepted his fate and dismissed his trial team, knowing that this was a game and it was rigged, and he said that he would rather have a proper defense than just a show trial, so he just wanted to be alone. So the marshal, at the end of the trial, was sentenced to death. He embraced his friends that defended him on the battlefield and in the courtroom, and he thanked them, and he asked to be with his family before he was executed. And when he was taken out to be executed, it was kind of funny. One of the soldiers actually asked if Ney wanted to be blindfolded, and Ney refused, and he said, "A soldier does not fear death, he meets it with open eyes." That was his last words, recorded. It was kind of funny enough, during the firing squad, half the men walked away. They refused to shoot him, because that's how much they respected Ney. So, yeah, that's about it. Marshal Ney, and it was a blast writing it and doing the research, and I got more episodes in the future. Thank you all, and I'll see you in the next one.